The Silence of the Lambs wasn't just a chilling psychological thriller. It was a brutal war between artistry and chaos. Beneath the polished, Oscar-winning veneer, the set was a pressure cooker, dangerous improvisations, casting betrayals, FBI meddling, and a lead actor who blurred the line between man and monster. What audiences saw was a masterpiece of precision. What happened behind the camera was messy, unpredictable, and at times terrifying. Today, we're diving into 20 weird facts about The Silence of the Lambs that most fans don't know. From Hopkins terrifying Jodie Foster without warning, to props pulled straight from real murder files, to a mysterious bonus fact that even diehards whisper about. Stay to the end. You'll never watch the movie the same way again. Now, let's begin. 1. Hopkins' first scene. Terrified everyone, including Foster. Anthony Hopkins didn't just play Hannibal Lecter. He erupted onto the set like a predator released from its cage. His very first scene with Jodie Foster was filmed with no rehearsal, by design. Director Jonathan Demme wanted raw fear. Hopkins stood perfectly still, never blinking, his piercing gaze locked on Foster. She later admitted she was genuinely trembling, not as Clarice Starling, but as herself. Hopkins improvised the slurping hiss after describing his fava beans and Chianti meal. It wasn't in the script. The crew froze, unsure if they should laugh or cry. That unscripted sound became the film's most chilling line. It wasn't method acting. It was psychological warfare, unleashed without warning. Foster later confessed she avoided casual conversation with Hopkins during filming, not out of disrespect, out of primal survival instinct. 2. Foster refused rehearsals with Hopkins. Jodie Foster wasn't just nervous. She deliberately avoided Hopkins off camera. After that first take, she realized his presence was overwhelming. She believed too much familiarity would drain the tension between Starling and Lecter. So she made a choice. No rehearsals, no small talk. When the cameras rolled, every exchange was electric because it was authentic. Foster admitted in later interviews that she was genuinely scared of Hopkins. The separation added layers of realism. Starling, the rookie FBI trainee, intimidated yet compelled by the caged genius. The strategy paid off. Critics raved about the unspoken electricity between the two. What audiences didn't know was that this wasn't chemistry. It was distance, fear, and carefully maintained mystery. It wasn't acting partners bonding. It was two strangers orbiting each other in deliberate discomfort. 3. The FBI helped write the script. This wasn't Hollywood fantasy. It was built with real law enforcement input. Screenwriter Ted Talley and director Jonathan Demme didn't want cliches. They wanted accuracy. So they worked directly with the FBI. The Bureau allowed access to Quantico, giving Foster a chance to shadow trainees, sit in on classes, and observe real psychological profiling sessions. It wasn't just research, it was recruitment. The FBI saw the film as a golden PR opportunity, especially to attract female agents. The portrayal of Starling as competent, tough, and intelligent wasn't just cinematic. It was propaganda by design. When the movie premiered, FBI applications reportedly surged. It wasn't art imitating life. It was life using art as a recruitment tool, with Hollywood as its megaphone. 4th Lecter's cell was designed to break the rules. The most iconic prison cell in film history wasn't realistic. It was cinematic trickery. In reality, high-security inmates like Lecter would never be housed behind glass. But Demme and his production team rejected traditional bars. They knew they needed uninterrupted views of Hopkins' face. Glass provided both clarity and eeriness. The set was lit to create reflections that made Lecter appear ghostly, almost otherworldly. Production designer Christy Zia admitted the cell's aesthetic wasn't about authenticity. It was about myth-making. The sterile white walls contrasted with Lecter's sinister calm, making him seem less like a prisoner and more like a specimen on display. It wasn't confinement. It was exhibition. The choice blurred the line between horror and art gallery, forcing audiences to gaze at evil without obstruction. 5. The moth wasn't just a prop. That death's head moth wasn't studio imagination. It was imported, fragile, and alive. Real tobacco hornworm moths were bred and handled by an insect wrangler on set. But here's the kicker. The skull-shaped pattern on the moth's back isn't real. It was added with paint and decals to heighten the symbolism. The moth represented transformation, Buffalo Bill's obsession with becoming something new. But handling the moths was tricky. They had to be refrigerated before filming to slow their movements. Actors and crew found themselves coaxing the insects awake with warm lights. It wasn't just creepy atmosphere. It was delicate biological stagecraft. Every flutter of the wings carried hidden weight, life, death, and the disturbing fragility of obsession. 6. Gene Hackman was supposed to direct and star. The Silence of the Lambs almost looked very different. Originally, Orion Pictures secured the rights with Gene Hackman attached to both direct and star. Hackman was fresh off his Oscar win for Mississippi Burning and saw the project as his next big step. But here's the twist. Once he read the full script, Hackman felt it was too dark, too violent, and potentially damaging to his image. He walked away, and financing nearly collapsed. Jonathan Demme was eventually brought in, a choice considered risky at the time because he was known for quirky comedies, not psychological thrillers. Yet that failure gave us Demme's iconic direction. It wasn't Hackman's grim interpretation. It was Demme's chilling, intimate vision. Hackman's departure wasn't a setback. It was a strange stroke of fate that reshaped cinema history. 7. Buffalo Bill was a patchwork of real killers. Buffalo Bill wasn't pulled from thin air. He was stitched together from real-world nightmares. Screenwriter Ted Talley and author Thomas Harris drew heavily from serial killers like Ed Gein, who skinned corpses, Ted Bundy, who lured women by pretending to be injured, and Gary Heidnik, who kept women captive in his basement. Bill's obsession with transformation, making a woman suit from skin, echoed Gein most clearly. But the brutality of his manipulations, his psychological games, and even his tenderness toward his dog. Precious came from years of true crime research. What audiences didn't know was that every disturbing trait was carefully chosen to feel both unreal and horrifyingly possible. Bill wasn't just a villain, he was a mirror reflecting humanity's darkest extremes back at us, not pure invention, but a mosaic of real horrors. 8. Ted Levine struggled with playing Buffalo Bill. Ted Levine's portrayal of Buffalo Bill is unforgettable, but it nearly destroyed him. Levine was terrified that he would be typecast as a monster. The role demanded disturbing acts, dancing in the mirror, tucking his body, whispering to himself in a warped voice. Levine pushed himself to dark psychological places, but later admitted he felt uncomfortable with how audiences might conflate him with the character. For months after the film's release, he struggled to find work. Casting directors and studios saw him only as that guy. Ironically, Levine was nothing like Bill in real life. He was thoughtful, shy, and deeply empathetic. Playing such a twisted character wasn't career elevation, it was career jeopardy. Levine eventually rebuilt his career with roles in Monk and Heat, but Lambs left scars he didn't anticipate. 9. The creepiest line was improvised. "You know what you look like to me, with your good bag and your cheap shoes?" That vicious monologue wasn't entirely scripted. Hopkins injected his own rhythm, his own venom, into Lecter's insults. He leaned closer, elongating the words, letting silence linger just long enough to make Foster squirm. Jodie Foster later admitted she didn't know what Hopkins would say or how he'd deliver it. That unpredictability turned the scene into pure electricity. The sting of his mockery wasn't theatrical. It felt personal, piercing through Foster's carefully built FBI facade. It wasn't just dialogue, it was psychological combat. Hopkins's improvisations made Lecter less like a character and more like an active threat. What audiences didn't realize is that Foster's tense reactions weren't rehearsed. They were spontaneous, born of genuine intimidation on set. 10. The Goodbye Horses. Scene almost didn't happen Buffalo. Bill's infamous dance to cue Lazarus's Goodbye Horses is now iconic, but it was nearly cut. The scene wasn't in the script. Ted Levine suggested it himself, arguing that Bill's psyche needed to be shown, not just described. Levine choreographed the unsettling performance with input from Demme, mixing vulnerability with menace. Producers were horrified. It felt too strange, too risky. But Demme insisted, saying it was crucial for understanding Bill's obsession with transformation. The song choice was a lucky find, a haunting track by an underground artist. Today, that scene defines the film's terror, not Bill killing, not Bill hunting, but Bill dancing, half-naked, fragile, and monstrous. It wasn't spectacle, it was revelation. Cutting it would have meant losing one of cinema's most disturbing windows into madness. 11. The crew was unnerved by Hopkins's stillness. Anthony Hopkins didn't rely on jump scares or theatrical outbursts. His weapon was stillness. On set, he would stand completely motionless between takes, watching cast and crew with unblinking eyes. Some crew members admitted they avoided making direct eye contact because it felt like Lecter was studying them. Hopkins even practiced minimizing his blinking so that his gaze seemed unnatural, almost reptilian. That subtle choice amplified his menace on screen. What audiences didn't know is that the tension wasn't just acting, it infected the entire production. Demme later said Hopkins dominated the space without moving a muscle. It wasn't shouting, it wasn't violence, it was quiet control. And before we reveal the next fact, go ahead and like and subscribe, because just like Lecter, this film still has secrets hiding in plain sight. 12. The film was shot out of sequence for a reason. The Silence of the Lambs wasn't filmed in chronological order, and it wasn't by accident. Demme deliberately scheduled the most intense Lecter-Starling scenes early. He wanted the actors to experience the rawest emotions before they became too comfortable with each other. For Jodie Foster, this meant diving headfirst into psychological warfare with Hopkins before she fully understood her character's arc. By the time the later, calmer scenes were shot, Foster had already been emotionally tested on set. The strategy worked. The audience feels Clarice's exhaustion, her vulnerability, and her emotional unraveling, because Foster lived it in reverse. It wasn't traditional filmmaking, it was psychological conditioning. By structuring the film this way, Demme turned the production schedule into a weapon, blurring performance with real tension. 13. Scott Glenn was haunted by FBI training. Scott Glenn, who played FBI agent Jack Crawford, wasn't spared from the darkness. As part of his preparation, the FBI gave him access to training materials, including real crime scene recordings. Glenn was played audio tapes of serial killer Lawrence Bittaker, torturing a victim, horrific evidence never meant for public ears. Glenn later said it haunted him for years, permanently altering his views on violence and the death penalty. He confessed he initially opposed capital punishment, but after that experience, his stance changed. It wasn't just role research, it was trauma disguised as education. The performance audiences praised as calm authority carried the weight of real psychological scars, not fiction, not rehearsal. But the brutal echoes of genuine human cruelty piped directly into his headphones. 14. The butterfly poster hides a dark secret. The promotional poster for The Silence of the Lambs is one of the most famous in film history. Jodie Foster's face with a death's head moth covering her mouth. But look closer. The skull on the moth's back isn't just a design, it's a famous photograph. The image is Salvador Dali's 1951 artwork in Volupta's Moors, which features a skull made of nude female bodies. The poster's designers deliberately embedded this reference, adding another layer of psychological disturbance. The visual suggests that beneath the surface, beauty lies hidden darkness, transformation, and death. Most audiences never noticed, but for those who did, the realization was chilling. It wasn't a random moth. It was a surreal piece of art history, twisted into a symbol of silence, horror, and identity. 15th. Lecter's costume was designed to break the human image. When Hannibal Lecter is wheeled into court, strapped to a dolly in his muzzle-like mask, it's one of the film's most haunting images. But that mask wasn't the first choice. Initially, the costume team considered a surgical mask or a traditional gag. Hopkins himself suggested something more primal, something that blurred human and animal. The final design was modeled loosely after a hockey mask, but with exposed teeth and cold straps that suggested a caged predator. The result wasn't just restraint, it was dehumanization. Lecter wasn't dressed like a man under control. He was dressed like a beast being transported. Audiences shivered because the costume didn't say inmate, it said monster. And in one unforgettable stroke, wardrobe turned Hopkins's character into living nightmare fuel. 16. The film faced fierce backlash from LGBTQ+ activists. When The Silence of the Lambs premiered, it wasn't universally celebrated. LGBTQ+ activists protested outside theaters, accusing the film of reinforcing harmful stereotypes. Buffalo Bill, with his obsession over transformation and body identity, was seen by some as a dangerous portrayal of queerness. Director Jonathan Demme later admitted he was devastated by the reaction. He never intended to equate Bill's pathology with LGBTQ+ identity. In fact, the script explicitly states Bill is not transgender, but audiences in 1991 didn't all catch that nuance. Demonstrations erupted during award season, with protesters holding signs reading, "Stop demonizing us." It wasn't a small controversy, it was a cultural reckoning. Demme went on to make Philadelphia in 1993, a film directly addressing AIDS and homophobia as a way of balancing his legacy. Not denial, atonement through art. 17th. Lecter barely blinks on screen. Ever notice how Lecter's gaze feels like a trap? That wasn't coincidence. Hopkins designed it. He studied footage of reptiles, noting how predatory animals rarely blink when sizing up prey. Hopkins trained himself to reduce blinking during takes, holding his eyes open just long enough to make it unsettling. The result was mesmerizing. Lecter feels less like a man and more like something alien, always watching, never vulnerable. Viewers felt pinned in their seats by that stare, as if he could see through the screen. Hopkins said later, "It's a small trick, but it unnerves people more than any scream ever could." It wasn't flashy acting, it was micropsychology, and it proved that sometimes the scariest thing an actor can do is simply nothing at all. 18. The ending was shot in total secrecy. The chilling phone call ending, "I'm having an old friend for dinner," wasn't shared with the crew until the last possible moment. Demme feared leaks and wanted maximum shock value. The pages were handed to Hopkins and Foster just before shooting. Even the supporting cast didn't know how the film would close. Hopkins recorded multiple variations of the line, some more playful, some more sinister. Demme chose the one that balanced elegance with menace. When the movie hit theaters, audiences erupted in gasps. Nobody saw it coming, not even most of the people who worked on the film. It wasn't just a twist ending, it was a locked box secret, sprung open only in the editing room. The kind of secret that made the film unforgettable. 19. It won the Big Five. Oscars a rare feat. The Silence of the Lambs didn't just win awards, it made history. At the 1992 Academy Awards, it swept the Big Five: Best Picture, Best Director, Best Actor, Best Actress, and Best Adapted Screenplay. Only 2 other films had ever done it: It Happened One Night and One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. What makes Lambs even stranger is that it wasn't a typical Oscar film. It was a horror thriller released in February, far from award season prime time. Instead, it rewrote the rulebook, proving that horror could be prestige. It wasn't a niche genre film anymore. It was art. The Academy didn't just hand it trophies, they legitimized an entire genre. 20th. Hannibal Lecter was on screen less than 17 minutes. Here's the final shocker. The most terrifying character in cinema appears for less than 17 minutes total. Hopkins Lecter dominates the story, the marketing, and the cultural memory. But in pure runtime, he's barely present. This was deliberate. Demme and Hopkins agreed that overexposure would weaken the character. Lecter needed to feel like a storm that rolls in, devastates, and leaves before you've caught your breath. His absence made him more powerful, his scenes more iconic. Hopkins himself said, "You don't need to be there the whole time. You need to haunt it." That scarcity transformed Lecter from a role into a legend. Bonus fact: The Real Silence of the Lambs. The film's title isn't just metaphor, it's rooted in a haunting personal story. During an early draft, Thomas Harris revealed that Clarice's confession about the screaming lambs came from real interviews with FBI trainees. One young agent recalled working on a farm as a child, unable to save lambs from slaughter. The memory of their screams haunted her into adulthood. Harris wove that into Clarice's backstory, symbolizing innocence lost and the desperate need to save just one life. For Jodie Foster, this scene was the emotional core of the film. She later admitted it was the hardest to shoot, not because of Lecter's taunting, but because she connected to the vulnerability in Clarice's voice. The silence wasn't just plot. It was the psychological wound that shaped her entire character. The Silence of the Lambs wasn't just a thriller. It was a cultural earthquake. It forced Hollywood to take horror seriously, forced audiences to confront true psychological terror, and forced actors into the deepest corners of human behavior. Behind every frame was chaos, secrecy, and artistry colliding. 30 years later, the film still whispers to us, still studies us from behind that glass. If you loved uncovering these hidden truths, make sure to like, subscribe, and comment on which fact shocked you the most. Because in the world of cinema secrets, one thing is certain: silence never lasts forever.